Hey everybody, it's Robert coming to you with another adventure into history. Oftentimes when we're exploring these old graveyards, whether they be small family cemeteries out in the woods or well-maintained cemeteries, we find the graves of Confederate soldiers, which is no surprise because of course we are in Georgia, which was a Confederate state. During the Civil War, if you were of fighting age and sometimes even younger, you are almost certainly going to serve the Confederate Army. So again, no surprise that we see a lot of Confederate soldiers around here. But a question that we often get asked is why we don't film the graves of Union soldiers. And it's because they're really not that common around here. After the war was over with, the Union soldiers would, generally speaking, go back home to their home states in the North, whereas Confederate soldiers who were from this area anyway returned back home. And of course there are Union graves around here down in the South. Most of them are around battlefields where the soldiers died. If the bodies could be identified, a lot of times they were returned home, but if they couldn't be identified, then they're generally still around battlefields as unknown soldiers. And of course the 13,000 who died at Andersonville Prison. But today we're going to tell you about the hidden grave of a Union soldier located here or somewhere near here in this cemetery that started as an old slave cemetery.
We are at what is known today as the St. John CME Cemetery. This is the former location of St. John CME Church. St. John CME Church still exists. It is located inside the city limits of Waverly Hall today, and it is known as St. John Pitts Memorial Church. But when it was first organized, it was built here, and it started here in the, I'd say after the Civil War, under a brush arbor. They had meetings under this big brush arbor, and then later they were able to build a church. And I believe that I read once that the first church here was built in 1874. But if we go on back before that, this was originally a slave burial ground. This was the burial ground of the Boddie family, the enslaved members of the plantation farm of Bennett V.R. Boddie and his wife, Elizabeth Boddie. Ben, as he was known as Ben. Ben Boddie and his wife, Elizabeth, owned several hundred acres of land northeast of Waverly Hall. All of the area that is now known as the Melody Lake subdivision, all the area that is now known as the Victoria Air Park area just north of town. You cross what's now Georgia Highway 85. Back in those days it was known as Flat Shoals Road. You cross that into this area where we are now, and it joined with the William Whitehead plantation, which was west of here. Now, William Whitehead's daughter was Ben Boddie's wife, Elizabeth. She was the daughter of William and Catherine Whitehead. Well, after the Civil War, Elizabeth Whitehead gave this piece of property, which was already a burial ground, and it's mentioned in the deeds to their plantation. She gave this burial ground to the folks that wanted to form a church. Prior to that, she had been very instrumental in helping to form a little black school. They used what was known as Mount Zion Methodist Church for a schoolhouse, and that's where the first education for the young black children after the Civil War took place. And they were later encouraged to build their own school, and they built one just east of Waverly Hall, just over the Talbot County line, and it was called Mount McCatherine, and that school stood for many years. And then later, when Waverly Hall was kind of organized into a little town, the school, the churches and all were moved into town. So we're on the outskirts of Waverly Hall, right here at the city limits, which is just right over there a little ways. And this is the former site of the St. John Church. The story goes that following the, right at the end of the Civil War, they had a battle in Columbus, and as the rebel soldiers were scattering, you know, they were losing the battle, so they scattered, and they fanned out into the area. And when they came out the Federal Road from Columbus to Waverly Hall, they got to Waverly Hall and they found a home being ransacked by a couple of Union soldiers. Well, when the Union soldiers saw these rebels that came up, they scattered. They hightailed it up the road. Confederate soldiers chased them, and somewhere near here they overtook the Yankee captain. And it was my understanding through what is printed in centennial edition of the Columbus Ledger Enquirer newspaper that the Yankee captain was from Ohio. And they hit him with a saber and broke his neck. Well, he died there on the scene. They captured the others that were with him and took them away from here. Now, you know, heaven only knows what became of those soldiers once they left here with them. But he was buried near here. And in 1945, the Waverly Hall Women's Civic Club wrote a little history book of Waverly Hall, and it was just reminiscences of the local people at the time. And they included a little story about the Yankee soldier who was killed here and buried near St. John Cemetery. St. John Cemetery covers, I'd say, what, 4 acres maybe 5 acres. This is a big cemetery. There are a lot of people buried here. I'd say a couple of hundred people. This cemetery is actually still in use, but this is supposedly where that Yankee soldier was buried.
And it's my understanding that he was buried here kind of in secret to hide the killing of him.
That's correct. He was buried here so that no one would ever know where he was buried, because not long after this was when Wilson's Raiders came through. They had been through here once going to Columbus. They came through here, you know, off and on. They were a detachment of Sherman's army. And, you know, there were a lot of them that came through here sporadically. And this little band that came through here on their own, they were just robbing and pillaging anything that they could. And the house that they were robbing at the time stood where the Methodist preacher's house is now, the Methodist parsonage on the hill on Highway 208, right in the center of Waverly Hall. And at the time, it was the home of a state representative, I believe, from Mississippi. Last name was Singleton. And Mr. Singleton had brought his family here as refugees. They had moved into the former home of Anderson Jones and his wife, Susan. Susan had died in 1861. So Anderson Jones apparently knew the Singletons, and he allowed them to move into their house. And that's where they were robbing the house when the rebel soldiers came along and caught them in the act. And of course they fled. They were chased down and attacked. But anyway, this cemetery started out as the Boddie family burial ground for all of the Boddie slaves. Then it became Boddie family descendants, and then all the members of the church that was organized here. So you have members of the Boddie, the Willises, the Cheneys, or a large group of folks buried here. Then we have later folks. We've got the Thomasons, we've got the Dunbars and the Culpepers. Whiteheads are a lot of graves out in that area. But right out in the middle of this cemetery is, there used to be a well, which was quite dangerous. There weren't too many people that knew that well was here. And it was just an uncurbed open hole that was covered over with vegetation. So that still exists somewhere. You want to see if we can find it?
Let's go find the well. Okay. So this is a really cool cemetery. Like Dan said, this is absolutely huge. So I'll show you real quick. This is the more modern part. So we have graves here, and then it goes out towards the road. And at first glance, you would assume that this would be the majority of the cemetery here. Where these graves are kind of well kept with a little roadway running between.
Yeah, I will say that this cemetery is still in use. It's landlocked, you know, it's busting at the seams, as you might say, because all the land around it is private property. And the family that owns the land just over the fence has tried to prohibit anyone from burying onto their property. And that's part of the problem here, is no one can define a clear property line. They say that someone came out and defined a line one time, or they went by this old fence that's right here, but no one really knows for sure. But over the years, this cemetery, it was a tradition, and it still is, that families would come and clean off this cemetery once a year, and that was the week before Mother's Day. That was always a tradition, the Saturday before Mother's Day and the week before that, prior to Mother's Day. They would always meet out here. And I've even got a newspaper article that features Mr. Joe Hamp. He was a Waverly Hall resident, and he would come out here, and Joe worked really hard when he was able, and he would come out here and clean off his parents' lot, and then he would clean off graves of friends that didn't have family. And so Joe would work out here sometimes 2 weeks, and you pass by and you would see Joe with his little fires burning where he was burning trash and, you know, sticks and leaves and debris. And one day, Columbus Ledger-Enquirer newspaper reporter passed by and saw Joe, and he stopped and he made a picture of Joe out here, and I have that newspaper article. That was back in, I forgot what the year was, 1980 something. But anyway, this, you know, as time marches on, there are not as many people left to maintain the cemetery like it used to be. There's still a few families that maintain plots out here once a year, the traditional way. There's some that, you know, there's just not any family left, and then there's some that just don't care, unfortunately. But this is a large cemetery, and there are a lot more graves back that way. I think that the church stood right here where this newer section is. This is where the church building was. And if I remember correctly, the well is out that direction. There used to be a big oak tree right next to the well, but I think the oak tree is gone now.
All right, well, we will head off that way. And we'll also probably see a lot more graves as we dip off into the woods.
Might know it would start raining even harder. I thought that was one of those little photograph things. Walk along this way.
Look at that, Dan.
Yeah, this is the older section of the cemetery.
Is this a drier spot?
It's not dry. It's drier, but it's not dry. We may have to sit this one out.
There's one right there. Oh, there's one right here. Oh, that's an MTA, yeah. We'll have to... It's interesting, that's a Columbus, Georgia. This is an MTA stone, which is Mosaic Templars of America, which was a organization founded by freed slaves to help former slaves after the Civil War. And there's another one that's nearby here, the grave of Samantha Street, but they all have lodges on them. Samantha Street's is Mahone's Delight Parlor, which was a local lodge. That one is from Columbus. Let me get you freed up there. Oh, you got caught all the way around. This is the mad dash for the truck right here. Oh wow. There's a grave right there.
And that was the day that Robert and Dan caught pneumonia.
I thought it had to be cold to catch pneumonia.
Oh no, you can catch pneumonia anytime.
Oh, well, shoot.
Oh.
All right, so I think we are going to be rained out for this adventure. Dan and I are still hiding in the truck here. What you got there, Dan?
I have this Columbus Ledger Enquirer Civil War Centennial Edition. It is all about the Chattahoochee Valley and what took place here during the Civil War.
And this has a story, partly about the story with the Union soldier who
It
was...
does. This has the story in it.
And we actually do have the other book in here.
History of Waverly Hall, Georgia, written in 1945 by the Junior Woman's Club, Waverly Hall, Georgia. Okay, this is from page 8 of the History of Waverly Hall by the Junior Woman's Club, 1945. So it is, well, it tells about the foxhole that the Bird brothers were put in when they were little by their grandmother. Have you read that before?
I have.
Okay, I'll skip over that. Anyway, it says there was much looting of personal property by the invading hordes in spite of the efforts the citizens made to conceal their valuables. There was, consequently, great resentment at the indignities to which the community was subjected, as evidenced by the fact that at least one Yankee soldier was killed and buried near the present St. John Methodist Church Cemetery. This is an interesting little book that was written at the time. First-hand account witnesses were still alive. Very interesting. And this is the newspaper article about Mr. Joe Hamp working at the cemetery. This was in May of 1983. Okay, this was talking about the capture of Columbus. It tells about there were other reports of looting, of course. One of them said the Federal raiders began their departure from Columbus Tuesday morning, April the 18th, with as much of the portable possessions of the citizens as they could carry off. General Wilson, according to one, took his leave in a carriage belonging to Mr. James C. Cook, and ensconced in the same vehicle were said to be two of the Cook's family servants, rigged up in high style in clothes belonging to their former owners. The troops did the same. In the midst of burning and looting, Confederate forces offered only piecemeal resistance, their defense having disintegrated and lost all semblance of organization and order. Some of the uncaptured rebels made isolated attacks on the Federal raiders. One band of rebels overtook a Yankee captain from Ohio, catching them in the act of robbing the house of Congressman Singleton of Mississippi, whose family had come to Georgia as refugees. Seeing the rebels, the Yanks rode off at breakneck speed. One rebel overtook the captain and with one blow from his saber broke the captain's neck. The others surrendered. And then it goes on to list other Confederates who managed to escape Columbus. Among them was Colonel Leon Van Zinken, Private John F. Benton, and others. So at some point, someone managed to interview someone who knew something about this. By cities captured. This continued from page 7. See if it gives credit to who wrote that. Looks like there's some pages missing. It goes from page 6 to page 11.